Greetings everyone, I'm Adam Haritan. Right now I'm standing next to a very common shrub that grows in eastern North America, and I'm wondering if you know what shrub this is. We can see that it has relatively smooth bark, yellow floral remnants, brown leaf buds, and brown fruiting capsules. I want to talk about this plant today for a few minutes because it provides a good example of how limited our perception can be when it comes to ecological awareness. When we hang out in a place that looks like this, and we find something interesting, we tend to ask two questions about the thing we just found. What is it and what is it good for? The first question is one of identity, the second question is one of value. Now, I don't think these are bad questions to ask. I mean, I did open up this video by asking you, what do you think the shrub is? And I alluded in the title of this video to its potential value. This is witch hazel, specifically American witch hazel. This is a medicinal woody plant that's commonly used as an astringent, and it's officially listed as an FDA-approved ingredient in topical formulas to relieve minor skin irritations. The primary constituents responsible for witch hazel's astringent, antibacterial, anti-inflammatory, and styptic qualities are tannins, flavanols, and proanthocyanidins. I have a personal connection to this plant because many years ago, even before I knew witch hazel grew in Pennsylvania, I purchased and went through many bottles of witch hazel extract to try to fix my poor complexion. And I like to think that it worked, but around the same time I also started eating a pretty strict diet. I started exercising, meditating, drinking high quality water, and consuming lots of vitamin A rich liver. Now, it's been a few years since I've used witch hazel for topical purposes, but this doesn't mean I don't value the plant today or that I ignore it completely. I appreciate witch hazel more than ever, but I want to go back to something I said earlier about how limited our perception can be, particularly when all we think we need to know when we encounter something unfamiliar is, what is it and can it feed or heal me? As good as those questions are, there's actually another important question, a third question we can ask when we encounter literally anything in the woods. And that third question is, what can this plant, or mushroom, or stone, or animal tell us about these woods? When we ask that question and we attempt to answer it, interesting things start to happen. We move in the direction of becoming ecologically literate, we make connections that we couldn't make before, and we begin to see where humans fit into the story. And I do think that this third question is another question of value because although we may not be seeking physical calories or physical medicine by asking it, we do receive some kind of intangible medicine that targets something much deeper, our mind and perhaps even our spirit. So what exactly does American witch hazel tell us about the land? Well, by its presence or absence, witch hazel tells us a lot about past disturbances. Now, a powerful storm or a sustained period of drought might not have a huge impact on witch hazel populations, but something like fire can. And that's because witch hazel is classified as a fire-sensitive species whose above-ground structures are easily killed, even by low-intensity fires. What this means is that if witch hazel density is high in a particular ecosystem, you can make a pretty good guess that fire has been absent on the landscape for some time. Now, it is true that witch hazel often grows alongside black cherry, tulip tree, red maple, and northern red oak in shaded, cool, moist ecosystems that are unlikely to be burned on a regular basis. So the absence of fire shouldn't surprise us here. But more and more these days, witch hazel is showing up in drier upland areas that historically have been fire dependent. Such ecosystems contain fire-tolerant trees like chestnut oak, black oak, and white oak. In these drier areas, witch hazel thrives in the absence of fire and disappears completely, or at least experiences significant reductions in density when periodic burns are reintroduced. Now, fire might seem like an obvious factor influencing the presence or absence of a shrub that has thin bark. But what about other forms of disturbance? Perhaps those that might have occurred not in the past 5 to 10 years, but in the past 50 to 100 years. How might these older forms of disturbance influence witch hazel? Well, when it comes to human-induced changes to the landscape, witch hazel might be able to tell us whether or not a particular woodland had been cultivated in the past century. A recent study published by the Ohio Biological Survey found that witch hazel is less likely to occur today on sites that had been cleared for cultivation way back in the 1930s, whether or not those sites were recently burned. Witch hazel, according to this study, is a reliable indicator of mature forests at least 80 years old with minimal disturbance. My observations agree with these findings. I typically see witch hazel in a mature or maturing forest that doesn't appear to have a history of cultivation in the past century. To show you what I mean, let's take a look at this ecosystem. Witch hazel is a common component of the understory of this maturing hardwood forest. The average age of the oldest trees might be 75 to 90 years old. Some of the trees might surpass 100 years of age. And the dominant species include northern red oak, black cherry, red maple, white oak, chestnut oak, and shingle oak. This area was certainly logged of its old growth trees, but I don't think this land was cultivated in the past century because the dominant trees here are rather mature and there's a lot of coarse woody debris on the ground. These are features you wouldn't really expect to find in areas that were cultivated after the 1930s. Let's now take a look at another wooded area that's only maybe half a mile from the previous woodland. Things are somewhat different here, although a few things are the same. The oldest trees here are younger than those found on the other property. I'd say the oldest trees might be 50, 60, maybe 75 years of age max. Interestingly, many of the trees growing here are the same species as those in the other woodland. Black cherry, red maple, white oak, and shingle oak. There's also some eastern white pine and a few other trees. No old growth remains in this woodland. Most of the trees aren't even mature, and I'd guess that the area was either cropland or maybe a hayfield in the past century because the ground is relatively smooth. I don't see any pit and mound topography. There is some woody debris on the ground, but most of it isn't that large. The understory contains a decent number of invasive species, and there is a nice-sized Norway spruce on the property, which is pretty indicative of former human habitation. Despite its tree composition being very similar to the other forest I showed you, and despite its close proximity to the other forest, this woodland lacks any sign of witch hazel. When we put all these observations together, we begin to see that witch hazel is a shade-tolerant, mid to late successional species that does very well in established woodland ecosystems. Such ecosystems are those that most likely haven't been the target of intense disturbance events over the past 100 years. And when we see witch hazel growing in a forest, we're also likely to see trees that may be at least 70, 80, 90 years of age or older. Pretty fascinating stuff, although I might be biased because I'm the one that created this video. But I don't think it's fascinating necessarily because what we covered provides raw information that makes us sound smart and intelligent, but because it allows us to do something that more and more humans are unable to do: read a landscape and perceive a story. Think of it this way. Imagine walking into a theater and watching a movie just long enough to only learn the names of the major characters and maybe one or two neat facts about them. Then you leave. You never learn anything about the characters' relations to one another. You never learn anything about their development. You never see how they fit into the bigger picture. Now put yourself out here in the woods. Imagine learning only names. Imagine learning only a few specific roles. Imagine visiting and not interacting. This is how humans are living today. And although this way of living may seem mostly harmless, all you have to do is peek into the human mind and soul to see what happens when humans decide they don't belong here anymore. But the good news is that it doesn't have to be like this, and it won't be like this if we learn to recognize that an utterly amazing story is unfolding out here right before our eyes, and it includes us. When we learn to see the connections between something like witch hazel and fire and old trees and cultivated land, we weave together a story and see that we belong. And if that isn't good medicine, I don't know what is.